Hi folks, Randy Rice here with Rice Consulting Services and another episode of the Value of Testing podcast. I'm really glad you joined me today, and our topic today is 10 questions to ask about your testing processes. So to begin with here, first of all, I want to kind of go over some concepts about, first of all, what is a process? And I want to bring out a few things so that at least we kind of have a common basis of understanding and that you'll kind of know where I'm coming from on the topic. And I'm not expecting you to adopt the same philosophy or mindset even necessarily, but I want to give you something to think about when it comes to process definition, especially in the context of software testing. So in this slide, I'm referencing something that came from the book Out of the Crisis by Dr. W. Edwards Deming. Now, if you're not familiar with Dr. Deming, he was probably the father, maybe grandfather, I'm not sure, of the quality movement that was really predominant back in the 1980s and 1990s. But even before that, post-World War II, we were in a process of helping Japan rebuild, and so they sent Dr. Deming over there, I guess the government, and he worked with a lot of the manufacturing companies there to improve their quality. Now, someone of my age remembers back in the day, in the 60s especially, when if anything was stamped made in Japan, it was automatically deemed to be inferior. Well, they learned quickly on how to improve their quality, and they became world class in quality. So what we see here is kind of a process that just is very assembly line in nature, but I would suggest that you could consider each of these little bursts of activity here as kind of a sprint if you're in the agile world, and I think most people are these days. But the idea here is that as you're working on things, you're also testing it, and you're also doing all kind of inspections and design, redesign, assembly, inspection, so forth, and eventually you'll distribute things out to your customers or maybe to other processes. So, we hear the term shift left, and we might think, hey, that's a recent idea. No, here it is in 1950, doing things early in a process to identify defects. Now, another way to see this workbench model is kind of like this, where you have your input, you have output, you have customer influence, for example, things that the customer likes and that they require in a product. And you also have resources down here to support what's going on here in the middle, which is what I'm depicting as the process. Now, before this, you have maybe other processes to deliver the input, and you have subsequent processes to accept the output from this. So you have these process boundaries in place as well. But in this process, you have the classic plan, do, check, act cycle. And in this plan, do, check, act cycle, sometimes called the PDCA cycle, you plan what you're going to do, you do it, you check it to see if it meets quality criteria, and then you take action on that. And if needed, you continue the cycle, and you just continue this cycle until you have acceptable output. Now, one of the cool things about these workbenches are that you can chain them together in a serial way. You can even go back upstream if you need to, but one workbench can lead to another one. Or you might have parallel processes here where one workbench, once it's completed, the output may go to several other workbenches that can be performed in parallel. Well, kind of a software centric view of this, or maybe contextual view of this, is something like this, where you have your suppliers which will give you input. Let's say we're talking about testing. Well, we receive things from the developers to test, and we have this entrance criteria which checks to make sure that what we're receiving to work on actually is acceptable. Does it meet the requirements of something that even is able for us to work on? So, but if it passes the entrance criteria, then we can start performing our work procedures. Now, if it doesn't, then we go back, we reject it, send it back, and we wait until we get something that does pass the entrance criteria. Now, at this point, I would just want to call out here that the procedures that you see in this box, those are the step-by-step things that you're doing with the product that you've received. So in the testing world, we may be designing tests, we may be putting those tests in executable format, performing the test, and those kind of things. But it's a procedural step-by-step thing. So there's a difference between a procedure and a process. A process is this bigger picture. So the procedure is part of that. It's an important part of that, but the process is more than that. Now, as we produce things, as things are coming out of our process, our procedures here, then we have our exit criteria. This could be a check to make sure that we met all the things that we were intended to meet, that we did all the tests we were supposed to, that we achieved the criteria we were supposed to. And if that's acceptable, then that goes out to either our customers or to the next activity. If it did not meet our exit criteria, then we go back and we keep working on it until it is acceptable. Now, a couple of things down here at the bottom that support our process. First of all, tools. These facilitate the process. These give us leverage and the ability to do things more efficiently. And we also have standards down here to give us guidance on how to do the work. Now, there is one thing that I'm not showing here in the workbench, and that would be the measurements and metrics that you can take not only from your entrance criteria, but from your procedures, from your exit criteria, actually from any aspect of this workbench. You can be obtaining metrics and measurements from that. So anyway, that's just kind of a look at maybe a view of a process from this workbench perspective. Okay, so now that we have this kind of understanding of a process, at least from that workbench perspective, I just kind of want to give a little bit more introduction just real quickly here about how many organizations, they think they have a testing process, but maybe really what they have is more like a collection of good habits. Now, good process is built on sound principles and practices, and without those principles and practices, then the process gradually just becomes a checklist that people start following without understanding why, or they may not follow at all. They may initially follow it, but then they kind of drift away. So the habits are the things that we've always done. We do them that way just because we've always done them that way. A process is a defined way of working, and it encompasses all the things that I just mentioned. But the principles are really important because those are the reasons behind the process. And they have some important questions really involved when you start thinking about principles, the reasons why we do things. Now, the questions I'm about to go into here, these are questions that I often ask during assessments. And if you're a leader in testing, or if you're over leaders in testing, or maybe you're a tester and you want to ask questions about your own testing process, here are some questions that you might want to pose about your testing process. First of all, can anyone describe your testing process? In other words, if I ask 5 people on your test team about the testing process, would I get 5 different answers? Another question is it documented? And I'm not talking about a 300-page manual here, but just a clear, understandable process, something that is expressed someplace, documented someplace. You know, if you don't really have it in writing or something, then it's really hard to understand. It's hard to improve. But I also have this Randyism. And that Randyism is I would rather have a 2-page process that people follow rather than a 2-inch binder that they ignore. And so really, it's not the size of the process that matters. It is it in a form that can actually be discussed and improved? And then another big question is, okay, you may have a process, it may be documented, but is it actually followed? And it's kind of interesting because sometimes the documented processes and the real processes are often very different. And this kind of also gets to another angle on processes. You may not have a process in writing, but I would suggest that you still have a process. You just don't have it documented anywhere. And you may have 5 versions of it that people are performing. Maybe that could be a reason for inconsistency in your testing. Then there's the big question, how do we know if the process is working and is it being followed? Whenever I work with an organization to establish either new processes or to improve their testing processes, one of the first big questions we have to ask and answer is, well, how do we know if it's working right or not? How do we know if people are following it? Well, that's where true quality assurance comes in. I'm not talking about testing. I'm talking about actual classical quality assurance that measures things, that establishes processes, that improves processes. See, this is the thing that happened when the terminology just got butchered and people started calling testing QA. I don't know where it started. I know about when it started. It was probably in the mid to late 90s that people just kind of started casually calling testing QA. But it was very unfortunate because when that happened, then no one was doing QA. And a lot of the QA departments were disbanded because what they were doing wasn't all that tangible. It wasn't the really hard technical stuff of testing. But QA is how we know if the processes are actually being followed. So we need someone to be doing that, whether that's a person on your test team, because the reality is most test teams might do some form of QA. It's just not their main job. Well, another question to ask and answer here is your process measured? Do you have metrics around it? Because one of the things is you can't improve what you don't understand, and the main way you can understand something is by measuring it. Now, you may have seen my previous podcast on meaningless metrics, where you need to be measuring the right things in the right way and measuring things for the right reason. So, I'm not talking about just measuring stuff for the sake of measuring it, but measure things like, what are your defect rates? What are your adoption rates of the process? Can you show who's doing what at which point in the process? All those things kind of give you insight into whether your testing process is working or if it's broken or not. Processes do fail. They do break. And many times people know they're broken, they just don't know where or why they're broken. And to find that out, you have to measure it. You have to go in and you have to start looking for answers. Another question to ask is it reviewed? When was the last time anyone actually evaluated whether your testing process still fits today's products and teams? Maybe this process was defined 5 years ago or something, and no one's looked at it since. People loosely follow it, perhaps, but no one actually has sat down and looked at it or brought someone like me in as a consultant to have an independent view of that process to look to see, hey, is it even matching what I'm seeing here in the real world? Another question to ask and answer is, does it evolve? When you do your lessons learned and your retrospectives, Is there any kind of follow-up in the process? Is it updated? Or once again, is it the same process you had 5 years ago? The lessons learned maybe are applied someplace, but maybe not to that testing process. And then a very important question, does everyone understand why it exists? You know, people are much more likely to follow a process when they understand its purpose. And I'll tell you something else. People are more likely to follow a process if they were involved in creating it or updating it. That they just need to know the why. Just kind of like measurements. There should be a why behind every metric. There should be a why behind every process as well. And then, does it improve product quality? That's really the ultimate question. You know, if you have a process that's generating more paperwork than progress, then you're really not doing much. You're not getting much insight into the products and the quality around those. The ultimate test is it actually doing any good in reducing defects and increasing confidence in the products that are being delivered? And finally, the 10th question, which parts of the process add the most value? Because really, that's what you're looking for here. That we're not just talking about processes that exist because we've always done it that way kind of story. You want to look at processes that actually add value, not take away value. It kind of reminds me of this story, and forgive me if you've heard this story before, but I'm going to try to tell it very quickly, about the young lady who came into the family and married into it, and she was cooking Thanksgiving dinner with her mother-in-law, and they were fixing this ham. And the mother-in-law, she cut off 1 inch off the ham before she put it into the pan or whatever to cook it, to bake it. And the young lady, she was kind of confused. Why in the world did you cut 1 inch off the ham? And she asked her mother-in-law that, and the mother-in-law didn't know. But she says, I tell you who does know, my mother, because she taught me how to do it this way. So when the grandmother comes in, they ask the grandmother, why'd you cut the inch off the ham? And the grandmother just kind of laughed and said, well, it's only because my pot could hold only such a size of a ham, and I had to cut off an end to make it fit. And, you know, I know it's a funny story and it's an old story, but we do things like that. You know, we do things for the sake of just, we've always done it that way. And so it's good to look back at your processes. It's good to look back at your practices to see, really, is there a justification for why you're doing those things? Now, here's kind of a challenging final question. It's not one of the 10, okay, but it's just something to think about. That if I ask your team to write down your organization's 5 testing principles, what are the things you hold on to? What are the things that you really try to embody in your testing? Could they do it? Now, if they can't, that might be where your improvement actually begins. You know, because I think before you go into processes, you have to know the principles and practices you're trying to embody there. And kind of a closing thought here too is that the quality of your testing process is directly related to the quality of the questions that you ask about it. Well, I hope this has been of help to you. I hope you subscribe, like, share, all that good stuff, and it really helps me keep this channel going. And I just really enjoy trying to bring some of this content to you. I would love to hear your comments below in the comments section, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thanks a lot for watching.